Today, let's talk about giants, because we saw in the Bible where David kills a giant with a little pebble. And actually, we know God came through for him in a big way. But what about those of us that maybe God didn't come through for us like we thought he would? Join us today. Good morning. Let's talk about giants today, all right? Let's talk about the giants that are in our life. And I want to encourage you with this. Encouraging truth number 76 is this: God kills giants with pebbles. Now we know that. God is that big. We saw that in the Bible where David and Goliath, and there's this story where David's a teenager and Goliath is this big 9.5-foot giant. And God came through for David. Because we know even on a good day with David, there's no way he ever could have won against this giant. But here's the thing, we all have our own giants in our life. Some of our giants are like a medical issue, a court date, an addiction, joblessness, a school test that's really important, a divorce, a financial problem, a wayward husband or a wayward child, or not being able to get pregnant. And we all are faced with giants. But here's what you need to know. Life on this earth is filled with giants looming on the horizon. But the cool thing with the story of David and Goliath is that we know this. We have a really big God that goes before us. We have a big God that can turn the hearts of people. A God that heals, a God that opens a womb, a God that can get you a job. Because we have seen that God can kill giants with pebbles. And for many of you, God has done just that, and you're like, yes, God, he's so awesome. But today I want to talk to those of you who maybe you don't feel like, yes, God, because you just kind of feel like God didn't do what you've been praying for him to do. He didn't come through for you how you actually thought he would. You didn't get healed. You didn't get the job. You still can't get pregnant. But I'm hoping today I can encourage you to say, you know what? You can still say, wow, God, you're awesome. And the reason is because how we handle our giants shows us how we feel about God. Because sometimes God does slay our giants differently and at a different time than we want. But sometimes the giants in our life prove where we are spiritually to say, God, am I close enough to you to trust you with this, even though I don't understand it? Here's a really good illustration. Rene Schlappler, he was a pastor at Twin Lakes Church. He wrote a book called Thrill Ride, and he talks about a man in his book. The guy's name is Dan. Dan becomes a Christian. He's super handsome, single dad, successful electrician. But one day he started getting a cough, and he started getting pneumonia. And unfortunately, because Dan had diabetes, the pneumonia complicated it. He goes into a coma for 2 months. He codes, they bring him back. They have to lacerate his voice box with a tracheal tube. And then they have to cut off his toes, feet, and legs. They also have to cut off his nose and his scalp. He wakes up out of a coma and he looks at what's left of him. Pastor Rene said that Dan had a great sense of humor, and he used to say, Pastor, I woke up and found I was half the man that I used to be. But Dan was faced with a huge giant. His voice was gone, his looks were gone, his legs were gone, his career skill was gone. But Dan had a really good attitude. He had a really good attitude about this giant. So the pastor asked him, Dan, what is your secret? And you know what Dan said? Dan said, I just believe that Romans 8:28 is true and that God works all things together for good. He believed it. God said it. All things will work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. All things. And Dan said, I chose to believe that all things. And that's a really good lesson for all of us. Whatever you're going through that's your giant, that isn't going well, you can say, you know what? Even though I didn't get the healing, even though I didn't get the job, what I can sit back and say, God, I know that your word is true. You're going to work all of this bad in my life for something really good. So for Dan, instead of facing his giant with bitterness and anger, he ran toward the giant. He embraced his new life. He started a ministry to quad and paraplegics in other countries, telling them about Jesus. And that will always be our choice when we are faced with giants. Because remember this, God could have healed him. God could have healed Dan. He could have been like David, thrown the pebbles, and boom, giant's gone. God could have never let this happen in the first place. But sometimes God doesn't slay our giants, and when he doesn't, we need to learn how to handle our disappointments like Dan did. So let's talk about David, little David. David was a shepherd. He was the youngest of 8 brothers. There was a king in the land, the first king of Israel. His name was King Saul. The prophet Samuel shows up one day to David's house and anoints David king. But David's like a teenager. And he's like, hello, we already have a king. So he just went back to tending sheep. And he waited until God opened the next door. And at this time, the Philistines were at war with the Israelites. They seemed to always be at war. But the Philistines were this aggressive people of war. They had superior weapons, they were iron makers, and they controlled Israel a lot over their weapon making. 1 Samuel 17:1 says this, now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They wanted to go against Israel. Verse 2, Saul, King Saul, and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with the valley between them. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. We say he was about 9.5 feet tall. But not only his height, but look at what he was wearing. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. The armor itself weighed about 125 pounds. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and bronze javelins slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. This is a really big man who had all of this equipment on and just looked like this giant monster out there up against all the little men of Israel. He stood, verse 8 says, and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. Again the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. But look at what verse 11 says. When Saul, King Saul of Israel, and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The giant was in front of them, and they were terrified. These were men who knew God, who should have focused on God, but they didn't. That was their first problem. They didn't focus on God. They focused on the problem that was right in front of them. A giant, a big giant. Some of you have really scary things in front of you right now. You have that bill that you can't pay, the scan that came back kind of bad, the job interview, you're not sure if it went well, the meeting with your boss, the divorce proceedings, that person who's ruining your reputation. And it dawned on me this. The problem is we focus on what is in front of us and not on the God above us. We focus on the problem and we forget to go upward and say, wait a minute, God, you know this is going on. See, the first thing you and I need to do when it comes to giants is turn our focus on God. God, you know all about this. You know what you're doing. I am going to take this as an opportunity to trust you, no matter how bad this looks. So let's talk about David. And how does David even get to this battlefield? Well, his brothers are fighting for Israel. They're the part of the group that's terrified of this giant. So David's dad tells David, hey, you need to go take some food to your brother. They're on the battle lines. So David does that in verse 20. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with a keeper, took the supplies, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. Verse 23, as he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. And then David says this, verse 26, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Like, this is a huge statement from a teenager who loves God. He's like, are you guys joking? Who is this giant? Serious, we have the living God that's on our side. Who does he think he is? A giant? So what? My God is so much bigger than him. And I realize with David that that's how I want to look at the giants that come into my life. See, most of us, we look at our situations the way the world looks at them. When the doctor says it's terminal, we just fall apart and believe it. When the judge grants the divorce, we just think it's final. But when we see this man who's in a coma and lost his legs, we think his life is over. Because we look at things that are right in front of us. But then we meet David, who is completely counterculture. He doesn't see people and situations through human eyes. He doesn't look at things through the eyes of what the world thinks or the culture thinks. Chuck Swindoll says this, David has been given the ability to see as God sees, and he was neither impressed nor intimidated, because no matter how big the giant might be, God is greater. And no matter how powerful he might be, God is all powerful. He sees people and situations from God's perspective. That's what David does. He sees people and situations from God's perspective. Wouldn't it be great if we could do the exact same thing? I wish I were more like David in that respect. I want to be able to look at a financial crisis and go, I don't know, God's going to provide. I want to look at a health crisis and say, you know what, God, I believe you can heal me, and if you do, that's awesome, but if you don't, you got other plans, and I'm all in with that. I want to look at a relationship crisis and see God's restoring power. I want to look at what seems completely impossible and always say, God, you can change this. You can do this. I'm trusting you. But I think it comes down to, I'm not trusting you, God, to do what I want. I'm trusting you, God, to do what you need to do in this situation. But I realize that most of the time, I don't think I really do that. I can still stay up at night worried about finances. Isn't that ridiculous? I don't know why that is. I have seen God provide over and over and over, and still at nighttime I can be like, oh, what's going to happen with this bill? Health, I can pray for someone. God, please heal them. I know you can. I know he can. A lot of times I don't have faith to know that he will, because I don't know what God's will is. So I'm like, oh yeah, sort of pray, God, heal them. Yeah, hopefully you will. It's very vague. It's kind of sad. Relationships, I see marriages that are just falling apart. And I'm like, God, I know you can heal this marriage. But I kind of know the people that are in the marriage, and they kind of stress me out. So see, I would love to be able to just say, you know what? I have a big faith in God. Of course I'm like David. But I'm really actually not. I want to be, but a lot of times I'm not. David is so different from me. I think it's because he's completely and utterly assured that God's going to come through for him in the scariest of situations. And I realize that's exactly how I want to run my life. Wouldn't it be great if I lost my job and said, oh, well, I don't know, God's going to take care of me, whatever. What if my husband left me today? I said, oh, well, God's big enough to take care of me. How about my friend gossiped about me, ruined my reputation? Oh, well, God can change people's hearts. He can make them know the truth. See, imagine if we focused on life like David did, like, my God is so much bigger than anything bad happening in my life. So David, little David, goes to King Saul. Verse 32 said, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. That's funny. Saul probably laughed at him. Saul says to David, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him. You're but a youth while he's been a warrior from youth. You're like a shepherd, for crying out loud. But that never deterred David. Now, here's the thing. David could have listened to Saul, gotten his feelings hurt, put his head down. I know, I'm only a kid. What was I thinking? But he didn't. He held his head up high and he said, wait a minute. The Spirit of God is leading me, giving me this idea, giving me the courage to do it. You know what? I think I'm going to do this, knowing and believing that what I am hearing, I really believe is from the Lord. David knew his God was powerful and mighty. David knew that God could have stopped this fight with Goliath at any time he needed to. His brothers could have sent us home. His dad could have, come down and said, David, let's go, you're coming home with me. Saul could have said, absolutely not. We would never let you do that. But all through this, David just keeps getting green lights. So he just forges ahead until God shuts a door. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. He said in verse 35, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by the beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like just one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. See, David is this man after God's own heart. And this is why he just trusts him. He just believes him. Verse 37 says, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David always gives credit to God, always. He never was like, yeah, I'm kind of awesome. I'm a great shepherd. I killed bears because, I worked out at the gym, and whenever I'm done tending sheep, I go, work to get really, really strong. He's like, no. None of that ever happened. God is the one who delivered me. And if he can do that with a lion and bear, why wouldn't I think that he could do this with an uncircumcised Philistine giant? And Saul says, okay, go for it. Go for it. Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Saul's probably laughing, thinking this is going to be a great show, better than the circus. Verse 40, he took a stick in his hand, chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and then put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. You would think that David would be terrified up close and personal with this giant. Terrified at his words, because he knew without God stepping in, David was a dead man. Not even a question about that. Without a miraculous intervention, this would be David's last day on earth. So, facing the giant means this. God, here is the giant. I feel like you want me to do something with this, and I believe you're going to come through like you did for David. And some of you are like, yep, did that. Said those exact words. Didn't work. I wrote a book. The book flopped. I sang for the worship team. They cut me off the team. I was so excited for my wedding. It was called off. But see, here's what we need to understand is that if you take the Bible as a whole, not just this one segment about David and Goliath, facing giants isn't even always about winning. We don't see everyone winning all their battles in the Bible. I mean, think about all the disciples that were martyred for their faith. Well, that doesn't sound like a win, but it actually was in the whole scope of things. But the key to trusting God with our giants is about this: allowing God to have his will done in our life. Just like Dan. See, things didn't turn out like Dan thought his life would turn out, but God used him in mighty ways. See, God doesn't always slay our giants, but he does use our giants. I believe God uses giants, and used this particular giant to get us and to get David to the point that David got. God used Goliath to make David trust him. Sometimes God uses our giants so that we can learn to trust him also. But we have to get to the point of saying this: God, I am stepping out and trusting you, however this turns out. However. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you, Mr. Goliath giant, up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Then it happened when the Philistine rose and quickly came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sunk into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And there you go. A really, really big faith in a really, really big God. So the question today is, what is your giant? And will you, like David or Dan, allow God to use whatever giant is in your life? What are you going to allow him to do? Allow him to do something with your giants. And it may not go the way you want it to, and it may go the way you want it to. But the bottom line is God wants to show the people around us what he can do. And sometimes, like Dan, it's what he can do with something really bad. What can God do? What can you show people around you by what God has done with your health or your divorce or your wayward kids or your addiction or whatever? See, here's what we know, which is our encouraging truth number 76, that God kills giants with pebbles. And we know that. We have a God that can kill giants with pebbles. We have a God who can heal and promote and change and save and fix and turn a heart and slay a giant. But sometimes, like Dan, it means something completely different. The loss of his voice, the loss of his legs. See, we look at David and we say, yay! What faith! What faith! And it shows people how awesome God is. But then we see Dan, and you know what I say? I say, what faith? What faith? To see his humor and his love for God without legs, without a voice. And to me, that shows me almost even more how awesome God is. So here's what we need to do when faced with a giant. Face the giant with absolute confidence that God can do anything. But before you go into the battle, stop and say, God, I want your will to be done. Because either way, David's way or Dan's way, people will come to Jesus by watching how you and I respond to what God does with our giants. Hope that helps today. Have a really good day.